Okay, welcome back everybody to lesson 1 of the histories of Herodotus. So in our introductory video, we talked about Herodotus' opening paragraph, in which he states his intention to recount the events of the conflict between Greece and Persia and the causes for them. So if you haven't watched the introductory video, you should definitely go back and do that before viewing this one. And you should also definitely read the assigned readings from week 1, which you can find in the rubric, which I've linked below, and in the description for the introductory video. So again, please watch the video, read the material, so you have more context for what I'm talking about here. Okay, so let's recap quickly. Let me bring the slides up here. So, in the introduction, we talked about Herodotus himself. Herodotus, who is considered the father of history, was born in Halicarnassus in modern-day Turkey. Little else is known about him, but he wrote his histories, which are the first real work of history in the Western tradition. Histories mainly concern the wars between, again, Greece and Persia, but he also talks about the culture and history of Greece, Western Asia, and Northern Africa. So going back to the slides for a minute, this is generally the world of Herodotus. We can see this is Greece, here's Italy, here's Northern Africa, here's Western Asia, here's Persia, right, which is the empire which goes to war with Greece, which is the main concern of the work. So, here's this area in modern day, right? Northern Africa, Europe, Greece, Western Asia. This is a more detailed, zoomed in version of Greece, and here's kind of Western Asia again. This is the Aegean Sea here. And then we're going to get to what we hopefully read this week. So, Herodotus starts his history by going back as far as the information he has available to him allows him to go back. He talks about a woman from Argos, which is a city here. Her name was Io. She was the king's daughter, and according to the Persians, she was taken by the Phoenicians to Egypt. So in response to this, the Persians kidnap the king of Tyre's daughter. Here's Tyre, right? This is a city in Phoenicia. Her name was Europa, and they carry her off as well a woman named Medea, who was the daughter of the king of Colchis. So the Phoenicians capture this Greek woman, and then the Persians say, well, if they did it, we can do it, so they capture these two Phoenician women. So all three of these women, it should be noted, were figures from Greek mythology. Io was thought to be a mortal lover of Zeus, and Medea was the granddaughter of the sun god Helios, while Europa was said to have been carried off not by the Persians, but by Zeus himself. So without reading any more, we can should be reminded of something which should be familiar to all of us, which is the story of the Trojan War, right? So Helen is carried off, right? She's this queen of Sparta, and she's carried off by the Trojan prince, and this sets off that conflict. So again, this is kind of a common pattern in Greek history. They look at history and they say, okay, these wars are generally caused by the kidnapping of prominent women. So Herodotus takes this tradition from Greek mythology and folklore, and he inserts it into his history because, again, he's the first historian, and this is really the only thing he has to draw from because he's talking about very ancient history long before he was born. So, of course, this is what Homer wrote about in the Iliad, as we talked about in the introduction. Things like the Iliad, poetry, that was the closest thing we'd really have to history, at least in the West, before Herodotus. So Herodotus, who is he's the first historian, is drawing from these myths and legends. And he's pretty clear that, this isn't necessarily that reliable of information. He cites Persian authorities of the past for this information. So it's relatively vague, but again, he doesn't know exactly where this information comes from. He makes it clear that both the Hellenes, or the Greeks, if you will, disagreed with the Persians about this story, and they have their own version of it, which he recounts, and I'm not going to repeat it here. Okay, so after this, Herodotus talks about the kidnapping of Helen. So he says that Priam, who we know as Paris, seeing what the Phoenicians and the Persians got away with, decides to capture Helen, and this, of course, sets off the war between Troy, and Sparta. So again, Herodotus is taking from all these myths and kind of inserting them into his own history. Let me adjust this. It's cutting off my head a little. There. Okay, so this is all happens in the first 5 paragraphs. He's gone through probably centuries and centuries of history. And then he moves away from myth and legend into kind of actual history. He begins to talk about King Croesus of Lydia, who died less than 100 years before the author was born. He died in the year 546 BC, whereas Herodotus was born in 584. So again, that's about a little more than 60 years apart. So here's an amphora, which is a kind of Greek pottery, and this is a excuse me, Croesus. He's sitting on a funeral pyre. So if we take a look at the map, again, this is the modern world, and this is the world, the ancient world. Lydia is located right here in what is modern-day Turkey. Right? So Herodotus describes that Croesus ruled over the people on this side of the river Halys, right? And by this side, he means his side, the Greek side. Excuse me. He tells us that Croesus was the first barbarian to rule over the Hellenes. And again, when he says barbarian, he simply means a non-Greek person. And that he subjected Ionia, Aeolus, and the Dorians. And that he made an alliance with Sparta. So before Croesus, he tells us that all Hellenes were free, and by this he means that they were independent states and not under the subjection of rule by a foreign power. So next we go into one of the parts of the reigns that are not assigned, so I'm going to go into a little more detail here. He goes into the story of how Croesus came to power. So we hear that the ancestors of Croesus had assumed the rule of Lydia from the Heraclid family. Excuse me. So they were named after Heracles, or Hercules, from whom they claimed descent. And this was very common in the Greek world for prominent families to claim descent from heroic or mythical figures like Hercules, who we see a statue of here. This is a Roman statue of Hercules. So it was common. So it's just, again, very common. The last rule of the Heraclid line was named Condulus. Now, Condulus had a beautiful wife, and he used to boast of her and of her beauty to his bodyguard, whose name was Gyges. And he thinks that Gyges doesn't believe him when he tells him how beautiful his wife is. So he comes up with this scheme where Gyges will hide behind the door of their room while his wife is changing her clothes. And he'll see her naked body, and in doing so, he'll then believe Condulus when he tells him that his wife is the most beautiful woman ever. Gyges is, of course, completely scandalized by this because in the Greek world, as in our own world, it was not considered appropriate to look at the naked body of someone else's wife. But of course, Condulus is the king, and he insists, so Gyges goes along with it. Here's a painting. Right, there's Gyges hiding behind the curtain. There's the wife. Unfortunately for Gyges, the wife sees him doing this, and she keeps it to herself. And then afterwards, she goes to Gyges in secret, and she tells him that either he must kill Condulus, and this will kind of restore justice in some sense, because Condulus came up with this terrible scheme, and then he who saw her naked will now be her husband. And he must do this, or he must die. So, caught between a rock and a hard place, Gyges agrees. He kills the king, Condulus, and marries his wife, and so takes the throne. He institutes a new line of kings who are called the Myrmidons. During his reign, he invades the city of Colophon, and his successor, whose name is Ardes, his son, spends his reign fighting back the invading Cimmerians, who were a nomadic people who originated possibly from the Pontic steppe in what we now refer to as southeastern Europe, which includes parts of Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, the Ukraine, Russia. And then he also attacks the city of Miletus during his reign. His son Sediades. I might be flubbing the pronunciation on some of these, so excuse me there. But his son continues his campaign, as does his grandson, Alyattes. This is now the great-grandson of Gyges, who finally decides to make peace. And after Alyattes died, Croesus, his son, receives the kingship in succession, being 5 and 30 years of age. So now Herodotus makes kind of a detour, which he often does, talking about the story of a poet and musician named Arion, who we see a painting of here, who lived at the same time as Alyattes. According to the people of Corinth and Lesbos, Arion was saved from drowning by a dolphin who carried him off on his back and brought him to Cape Tenarian, from where he escaped back to Corinth. So this is just kind of this fanciful story that Herodotus feels the need to repeat. So now we return to our narrative and to our assigned readings. So we should have read that Croesus, greatly expands the territory of Lydia. He attacks the Ephesians, the Ionians, the Aeolians. He conquers Phrygia, Mysia, Marianda, Calibus, Paphlagonia, Thrace, Caria, Ionia, and the territory of the Dorians, Aeolus, and Pamphylia. So he conquers all these territories and greatly expands the Lydian Empire. And now we come to another area book that I didn't assign. In these passages, Herodotus tells us of a dream that Croesus had where he perceives that his son Aeetes will die, that he will die from wounds by an iron spear, specifically. So the Mysians, soon after this, come to Croesus requesting aid in hunting a wild boar. And his son, Aeetes, persuades his father to allow him to go on the hunt. Croesus asks the suppliant at his court, Adrastos, to watch over his son, as he's still very worried about this dream. But unfortunately, Aeetes ends up being killed by Adrastos' own spear, accidentally. Adrastos, after this, kills himself in chain, and Croesus mourns his son for 2 years. So here we see something that is very common in Herodotus and in Greek history in general, where someone will be trying to prevent some kind of prophecy or dream or portent from being fulfilled, or they'll misinterpret it, and in doing so, they'll end up winding up being the cause of this thing happening. We see something very similar play out with Croesus, as you've read. So, on hearing of the conquest of Cyrus of Persia, Croesus ends his mourning and he contemplates an invasion of Persia. But first he goes to an oracle to help him decide. Now, oracles are very, very important in ancient Greece. They're essentially like prophets who live in these ancient Greek temples, and they claim to receive messages from the gods. So ancient Greek leaders, military leaders, civil leaders will go to them for advice to try to figure out what the gods might be planning, to get ideas about what might happen in the future, and they'll base their decisions largely on these prophecies. So this is very, very important in Greek history. So Croesus goes to a bunch of different temples to find out what they might have to say, and as you've read, he tests them to figure out which is the best one. He ultimately here decides to go with this one temple who tell him that an expedition against Persia will destroy a great empire. He believes that this is the empire that they're referring to is Persia, that he is destined to destroy it. So he goes about making war on them. So we're told that he seeks allies among the Hellenes, the most renowned of whom, according to Herodotus, were the Athenians and the Spartans. And Herodotus will briefly recount the origins of both peoples. So the Athenians, he tells us, were Pelasgians, which is simply the author's term for Mediterranean populations who lived before the Hellenic period. That is from 507 to 323 BC, as we said. And then he proceeds to make conjectures on the languages of the Pelasgians. And he concludes that they must have spoken a barbarian, again, that is non-Greek language, and that the Athenians adopted a new language and gave up this language when they settled in Attica. He then proceeds with the origins of Athens. So you should remember he talks about the tyranny of Pisistratos. Now we should note that the word tyranny traditionally did not have the negative connotations it does today. Excuse me. We now associate the term with oppression and despotism, things like this. But when Herodotus refers to tyranny, he simply means rule by a single person who has direct control over his state and who is unconstrained by other political institutions. Now, Herodotus himself is opposed to tyranny, but in general, people in his time, some were in favor of it and some were not. So it does not have the same connotations it does today. So that should be kept in mind. So anyway, Pisistratos comes to power, you should remember, by forming a faction. He calls it the Hills District, and he competes with the Plains District under a man named Lycurgus, and the Coastal District, the Coastal District under a man named Megacles. He uses his previous victory in capturing the port of Nicaea to win the favor of the Athenians, and they support him in a revolt against these other two factions, and he takes control. After this, he is driven out of Athens. Megacles and Lycurgus unite to drive him out. And then we come to one of the strangest episodes in all of Asian history. So Pisistratos returns to Athens in a golden chariot, accompanied by a tall woman who is dressed as the goddess Athena. And according to Herodotus, this fooled the Athenians. They believe that this is really the goddess and that she's giving her approval to his rule, and he's able to take control again. Now, Herodotus himself is very skeptical about this story. He refers to it as the silliest scheme he's ever heard of. Some modern scholars have surmised that this may have been a political maneuver on his part, that the Athenians were aware that this wasn't actually the goddess, and that he was simply drawing comparisons between himself and the ancient kings of Athens who would have done similar things. So he's saying, like, I am like these kings, and I deserve to rule as they did. But in any case, he takes over Athens once again, until he's exiled for a second time, when he insults the daughter of Megacles, who he's married to, and he's driven out once again. But he forms a large army with revenue collected from older debts, and he marches on Athens, finally solidifying his control once and for all. So then we move over from Athens to Sparta. We hear about the reforms of Lycurgus. Let me bring up. This is a statue of Lycurgus, the law court of Brussels, which can be seen today. So according to Herodotus, Lycurgus received an oracle from the Pythia at Delphi. So the Pythia, again, were these sort of prophets and prophetesses who I've talked about. Delphi was the most important temple where these prophecies would come from in the Greek world. So if you look, here's a map. This is where Delphi was located, right? Here's Sparta. Athens is around here. So anyway, Lycurgus receives this oracle. And some say that the laws that he established were received directly from this oracle, but the Lacedaemonians, that is the people of Lacedaemonia, which is the area that Sparta ruled over, they say that he brought them from Crete, which was an island that he was the regent or the king over. And he when he came to Sparta, he brought these laws with him. So quick note, when Herodotus talks about the Lacedaemonians, he's talking about anyone living in the area ruled by Sparta. If he's talking specifically about, citizens of the Greek state, he will refer to them as Spartans. So Spartans are citizens of the Greek state who have privileged status. Lacedaemonians is anyone living under their rule. So Herodotus will later expand on the details of the system of government that Lycurgus set up, and we'll continue to see that he has a rather scattered approach to history. So we'll go back to Lycurgus later on. So a quick aside here. We talked about these temples where these oracles were received. This is the ruins. Excuse me, I got my knife. Okay, this is the ruins of the Amphitheon of Oropus, which was a Greek temple, an important Greek temple where a lot of oracles and things were received. You can see another picture of it here. And this can still be visited in Greece today. Definitely worth checking out. Anyway, so we were talking about Lycurgus, which we'll go back to later on. So after consulting an oracle, we hear that the Spartans marched on Tegea and are defeated. He's continuing to talk about the origins of the Spartan state. And he tells us that the Spartans were often defeated in the early days. And once, when they were at war with the people of Tegea, they went to the oracle at Delphi. So here's Tegea, here's Delphi, to find out how to defeat them. And they are given this cryptic message. There is a place called Tegea. It lays in Arcadia's plain, where two winds blast by powerful force, and stroke meets counterstroke. Woe lies upon woe. The son of Agamemnon in this fertile earth lies. Tegea's guardian you will be when you have brought him home. So they're very puzzled by this, but it ends up that what they must do is find the bones of Orestes, who is the son of Agamemnon, and bring his bones back to Sparta, thus bringing home the son of Agamemnon. And after this, according to Herodotus, they are always victorious. So this is again a bit of myth or folklore, which Herodotus is drawing on for his histories. This is his explanation for why they're always victorious. So, then we go back to Croesus. Croesus ultimately decides to ally with Sparta, as Sparta was the major military power in that area of the world. And he invades Cappadocia, which was ruled at this time by Sparta, by Persia, making war on Persia. So, according to Herodotus, he does this in part to make revenge against Cyrus of Persia, who had conquered Croesus' brother-in-law, Astyages. So he will later relate, and you should have read this, how Astyages, who was the king of Media, became the brother-in-law of Croesus, because the Lydians and Medes were at war with each other, and in order to make peace, Astyages marries Croesus' sister, who's the daughter of Alyattes, who was the king at the time. So Croesus is angry that his brother-in-law has been invaded, his territory has been invaded by Persia, so this is part of his reason for making war on Persia. In any case, Croesus crosses the Halys River, which is here, right, with his army, and they do battle with the Persians at Bacteria, which is located right here. This is an indecisive battle, and ultimately Croesus retreats to Sardis with his army. And here Cyrus pursues him, and there's a lengthy siege, and it's, if you recall, portended or overshadowed by the arrival of a swarm of snakes before the city gate. So during the siege, Croesus calls on Sparta for aid, but unfortunately for him, the Spartans are busy. They're at war with Argos over the territory of Thyrea. So here we come to another very remarkable story from ancient history, where the Spartans and the Argives, that is the people from Argos, they both pick 300 of their best warriors to fight exclusively in order to avoid a larger conflict. So they're going to have their champions fight each other, and then there won't be so much bloodshed. This was called the Battle of the Champions. Well, fortunately, however, for both sides, the results of this engagement were indecisive, and a full-scale battle ensues, and Sparta is ultimately victorious. But in any case, the Lydians and Croesus are left without aid at Sardis, and they're eventually defeated by the Persians. And Croesus himself is saved from death by his mute son in a rather tragic episode. Here we see him on the funeral pyre. Okay, so, in summary, Herodotus begins by recounting the mythological stories of abductions. We hear about Io of Argos, who was abducted by the Phoenicians, Europa of Tyre, and Media of Colchis, who were both abducted by Greeks. Helen of Sparta is abducted by the Trojans. So then we go into the history of Croesus of Lydia. His ancestor Gyges killed King Condoleezza at the urging of his wife when he saw her naked. Gyges is succeeded by his son Ardes, who is succeeded by his son Alyattes, who was the father of Croesus. Croesus greatly expanded the Lydian Empire, and it reaches its peak under his reign. His son is killed in a boar hunt, an event which is foreshadowed by an oracle. He goes to war with the, at the time, expanding Persian Empire, and it is foretold that a war with Persia will destroy a mighty empire, who he believes is the Persian Empire. Of course, this turns out not to be true. It turns out that the empire referred to in the prophecy was his own empire, and his own actions lead to his own downfall. And again, this establishes a trend. This is going to continue to happen in Herodotus history and in Greek history in general. Where people will misinterpret these oracular predictions, and their misinterpretation is what leads the predictions to come true. Okay, so Croesus goes to war. He seeks allies among the Spartans. There's a digression on the origins of Athens and Persia. We hear about the tyrant Pisistratos and the reforms of Lycurgus of Sparta. And then there's another digression on the Spartans and the bones of Orestes of Agamemnon, which, according to Herodotus, this explains why they're always victorious. Croesus invades Cappadocia. He's defeated and flees to Sardis. There's another digression on the Battle of the Champions between Spartan and Argos. And then Sparta, since they're not able to aid him, excuse me, without Spartan aid, Sardis is overthrown by Cyrus of Persia, and Croesus is captured. So next time, we'll pick up here. We'll see what becomes of Croesus, and we'll hear about the origins of Cyrus of Persia, the origins of the Persian Empire. So that's what we'll pick up next time. Again, please look at the readings for next week. Make sure you look at the excuse me. I had a brain freeze there. But yeah, make sure you look at the readings for next week in the rubric, which I've linked below. And I'll see you next week. So thanks for watching, and God bless.